The hardest truths are never buried beneath the ground. They are buried inside the hearts of those who never stopped waiting. Every October 14th, before the rest of Cedar Ridge had fully awakened, Ethan Walker followed the same quiet road that had become as familiar to him as the lines on his weathered hands. His old pickup truck rolled slowly beneath towering maple trees whose leaves glowed crimson beneath the first light of dawn. 20 years had passed since the morning that had divided his life into before and after. 20 years since the world told him his wife was gone forever. Yet every year he returned to the same cemetery carrying fresh white lilies because love had never learned how to count the passing seasons. The hill overlooking the valley was peaceful, wrapped in a thin layer of morning mist that softened every headstone into pale silhouettes. Church bells drifted through the cool autumn air from the little white chapel across the road, and the scent of damp grass mixed with pine needles reminded Ethan of countless Sunday mornings he and Emily had once shared together. He stepped out of the truck wearing the same faded denim jacket he had owned since his early 30s. Inside the left pocket rested his wedding ring, polished smooth after 2 decades of absent-mindedly turning it between his fingers whenever loneliness became too heavy to carry. Ethan never remarried. He never removed Emily from the family photographs. He never stopped believing that loving someone did not end simply because life refused to be fair. He walked quietly through the iron gate with the bouquet resting gently against his arm, nodding politely to the elderly groundskeeper who always seemed to understand that grief did not require conversation. Gravel crunched beneath his boots while a gentle breeze carried a swirl of golden leaves across the narrow pathway. Everything felt exactly as it had every October, until it did not. As Ethan reached the familiar marble headstone engraved with Emily Walker's name, he noticed 3 figures standing silently beside it. One was the groundskeeper speaking softly to someone he did not recognize. Another was a young woman with long blonde hair whose posture seemed strangely familiar, although he was certain they had never met. The third figure stood with her back turned toward him, her auburn hair moving gently with the wind. Ethan slowed his steps. Something inside him tightened without warning. The woman slowly turned around. The bouquet slipped from his hand before he even realized his fingers had opened. White lilies scattered across the grass. The woman standing before him possessed Emily's face. The same warm green eyes. The same gentle smile. The same quiet grace that had lived inside every memory he had protected for 20 years. Reason told him it could not be real. His heart refused to listen. His breathing became shallow while the morning seemed to lose every sound except the beating of his own heart. Before Ethan could speak, the young woman stepped forward. She looked directly into his eyes with a mixture of hope and fear that seemed far older than her years. Then he noticed the detail that stole the last certainty from his world. Her eyes were not Emily's. They were his. Identical in color, shape, and quiet expression, they reflected back at him as though he were staring into a forgotten piece of his own life that had somehow been waiting beside a grave for him to come home. The young woman did not look away. She stood quietly beside the woman with Emily's face, her fingers tightly wrapped around the strap of a worn leather satchel, as though it contained something too precious to risk dropping. Ethan searched both of their faces again, hoping that one more careful glance would reveal the illusion his mind insisted must exist. It never came. The resemblance was impossible. Every feature of the older woman reminded him of the wife he had buried without ever seeing one final time. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "Who are you?" The woman answered with a calmness that suggested she had rehearsed this moment for years. "My name is Hannah Brooks." She paused, allowing the silence to settle gently between them. "Emily was my identical twin sister." Ethan stared at her, unable to move. Emily had once mentioned a twin during their college years, explaining that family. Circumstances had separated them while they were still children. They had searched for one another for years without success before life pulled them in different directions. After the accident, Ethan had never heard the name again. Hannah looked toward Emily's headstone before continuing. "I found my sister 6 years ago, but by then time had already taken more than either of us could recover." Ethan slowly shook his head. "That cannot be possible. Emily died 20 years ago." Hannah's expression softened with quiet compassion. "That is what every official record said." A cool breeze swept across the cemetery, carrying dry maple leaves over the gravel path while church bells echoed faintly across the valley. The young woman finally stepped forward. Her blue eyes reflected uncertainty, hope, and years of unanswered questions. "Mr. Walker," she said gently, "I know this is impossible to understand." Ethan looked directly into her face. The shape of her eyes belonged to him. The warmth inside them belonged to Emily. "Have we met before?" he asked. She slowly shook her head. "Not face to face." Her answer only deepened the mystery. Ethan frowned. "Then why do you look at me as though you already know me?" She hesitated before answering. "Because I do." Hannah rested a reassuring hand on the young woman's shoulder. "Her name is Grace." Ethan repeated the name quietly, almost testing how it sounded. "Grace." She smiled with visible emotion. "My mother chose that name." Ethan felt his heartbeat quicken again. "Your mother?" Grace nodded. "She spoke about you throughout my entire childhood." Ethan stared at her without speaking. Grace carefully reached into her satchel, but stopped before removing anything. "I have carried something for 3 years," she whispered. "I promised myself I would only give it to you when I knew you were exactly the man she described." Ethan could barely steady his breathing. "Who was your mother?" Grace looked toward Emily's headstone, then back into his eyes. Tears shimmered beneath the morning light, but her voice remained steady. "The woman you never stopped loving." She slowly removed a weathered leather journal tied with a faded blue ribbon and held it toward him with both hands. "She spent 20 years trying to tell you everything that happened. She prayed that one day these pages would finally find their way home." For several long seconds, Ethan could not bring himself to reach for the journal. It rested in Grace's outstretched hands like something far too fragile to survive another disappointment. The faded blue ribbon around its worn leather cover fluttered gently in the cool October breeze, and even from where he stood, he recognized the careful way it had been tied. Emily had always fastened gifts with the same simple knot because she believed beautiful things did not need complicated ribbons. His fingers trembled as he finally accepted the journal. The leather felt softened by years of careful handling, its edges worn smooth by countless moments spent in loving hands. He ran his thumb across the cover and closed his eyes. For an instant, the scent of old paper mixed with cedar and lavender carried him back to quiet evenings when Emily would sit beside the fireplace writing while soft music drifted through their little farmhouse. Grace watched him silently. She had imagined this moment almost every day for 3 years, yet now that it had finally arrived, she discovered there were no perfect words capable of carrying 20 years of silence. Hannah stepped back respectfully, allowing only the whisper of rustling maple leaves to fill the space between father and daughter. Ethan slowly untied the faded ribbon and opened the first page. His breath caught before he even read a single sentence. It was Emily's handwriting. Every graceful letter, every tiny curve beneath the date, every familiar flourish belonged unmistakably to the woman he had loved. The page was dated exactly 7 days after the accident. He forced himself to continue reading. "If these pages ever reach you, then hope has traveled farther than either of us believed possible. I cannot remember your face today, but my heart keeps telling me that somewhere there is a man who loves me, and somewhere there is a home waiting for me." Ethan lowered the journal for a moment as tears quietly blurred the words before him. Grace looked toward Emily's headstone and whispered, "She never stopped writing to you." Ethan swallowed hard and opened the next page. Emily described waking inside a small county hospital after being rescued miles away from where anyone had been searching. Flooded roads, damaged records, and emergency transfers between hospitals had left her temporarily registered under an unidentified patient file while she struggled with severe memory loss. Doctors assured her that memories sometimes returned slowly, one small piece at a time. She remembered the sound of church bells before she remembered names. She remembered the smell of fresh coffee before she remembered kitchens. She remembered feeling loved long before she remembered who had loved her. Ethan continued turning the pages. Every entry carried the same quiet determination. Emily wrote about searching for forgotten pieces of herself, believing that somewhere beyond the confusion there was a life worth finding again. Then his eyes stopped on one sentence written with darker ink than the rest. Today the doctor smiled before speaking. "He told me I am going to have a baby. I still cannot remember my husband's face, but I already know our child deserves to grow up knowing how deeply she was loved before she was ever born." Ethan slowly lifted his eyes toward Grace. She did not have to say a single word. The truth had already begun speaking for itself. The pages grew heavier with every memory Ethan uncovered, as though each sentence carried the weight of an entire year that neither of them had been allowed to live together. His fingers moved carefully across the faded paper, almost afraid that turning another page might somehow erase the fragile connection he had just found again. Grace remained beside him without speaking. She had read every line dozens of times during lonely evenings. Yet watching her father discover them for the first time transformed familiar words into something entirely new. Hannah quietly stepped toward a nearby bench, allowing the gentle rhythm of autumn leaves and distant church bells to surround the silence. Ethan continued reading. Emily wrote that months passed before fragments of her life began returning. Sometimes a melody drifting from a passing radio would stop her in the middle of a grocery store. Sometimes the smell of engine oil reminded her of warm afternoons spent waiting inside a small-town garage. Sometimes she woke before sunrise with tears already on her face, certain someone important was waiting just beyond the edge of memory. Doctors encouraged patience, explaining that recovery rarely followed a straight path. Emily accepted every small memory as a gift, writing each one into the journal before it could disappear again. She feared forgetting twice even more than she feared never remembering it all. Another page revealed the names Walter and Louise Bennett, the elderly couple who welcomed her into their farmhouse after she left rehabilitation. They never pressured her to become someone she could not yet remember. Instead, they gave her a quiet room, warm meals, and the gentle kindness of people who believed healing could not be rushed. Emily wrote that their compassion restored more than her strength. It restored her faith that goodness still existed even when life no longer made sense. Ethan paused, feeling an unexpected gratitude toward strangers he had never met. Without them, Grace might never have been given the loving childhood Emily always dreamed of providing. He turned another page. The handwriting grew steadier. Today I remembered his laugh. Ethan stopped breathing for a moment. Emily described hearing a mechanic whistle outside a small hardware store, and the familiar sound suddenly unlocked an afternoon they had spent restoring an old truck together before sharing milkshakes at the local diner. She still could not remember Ethan's face clearly, but she remembered the way he laughed whenever she teased him about collecting rusty pickup trucks that nobody else wanted. Emily ended the entry with a single sentence written in darker ink. The more I remember him, the more I realize I have never truly been alone. Ethan closed the journal briefly and looked across the quiet cemetery. The morning sunlight had grown warmer, casting long golden beams between rows of marble headstones while the mist slowly disappeared. Grace finally broke the silence. She always believed memory would bring her home. Ethan looked back toward the journal and opened the next page. The date had advanced almost another year. The first sentence waited alone at the top of the paper, as though Emily herself understood that no other words belonged beside it. Today I finally remembered my husband's name. His name is Ethan Walker, and I have spent every day loving him, even when I could not remember why. The next pages carried the quiet rhythm of ordinary years, each entry revealing not grand adventures, but the gentle moments that quietly shape a family. Ethan continued reading while the autumn breeze turned a few loose leaves across the cemetery path. Emily wrote about Grace's first smile, her first birthday, and the afternoon she took her first unsteady steps across the wooden floor of the Bennett farmhouse. Every joyful memory was followed by the same promise. One day I will tell her about her father. Ethan felt his throat tighten as he imagined the childhood he had never known existed. Grace lowered her eyes, remembering the evenings when her mother would sit beside her bed with the journal resting on her lap instead of a storybook. She never let me believe I had been abandoned, Grace said softly. She always told me that somewhere there was a good man who loved me before he even knew I had been born. Ethan looked at her with quiet disbelief. For 20 years he had carried the weight of thinking he had lost everything, while only a few states away a little girl had been growing up believing in a father she had never met. He returned to the journal. Emily described the day every missing memory finally returned. It happened during a Sunday church service when the congregation began singing the hymn that had played during their wedding. She wrote that the first face she saw in her mind was Ethan's, standing on the porch of their little farmhouse with 2 steaming mugs of coffee in his hands. She remembered the old pickup truck, the white swing beneath the porch roof, and the tiny heart they had carved into the oak tree after becoming engaged. The memories returned all at once, bringing both overwhelming joy and heartbreaking regret. Emily immediately began searching for Ethan, but the years had changed addresses, phone numbers, and familiar routines. The Bennett family helped her contact agencies, search public records, and write letters that were never answered because they had been mailed to places Ethan no longer lived. Time seemed determined to keep them apart even after memory had finally brought them together again. Then another journal entry changed its tone. Emily explained that complications from the injuries she suffered years earlier had gradually weakened her health. Her doctors encouraged her to avoid long journeys until her condition stabilized, believing that additional treatment offered hope. She accepted their advice, convinced she would recover soon enough to make the trip herself. Instead of surrendering to fear, she devoted every spare moment to preparing Grace for the day they would finally find Ethan together. She filled boxes with photographs, letters, recipes, family stories, and every detail she could remember about the man she still loved. "If life gives me enough time," she wrote, "I will place these treasures into Ethan's hands myself. If life chooses another path, then Grace will finish the journey I began." Ethan slowly closed the journal for a moment and looked toward Grace. Their eyes met across 20 silent years. Neither of them spoke, because some truths arrive so gently that words only become unnecessary. The final pages of the journal no longer sounded like someone searching for the past. They sounded like a mother preparing her daughter for the future. Ethan turned each page slowly, unwilling to rush through words that had waited 20 years to reach him. Emily described Grace growing into a thoughtful young woman who loved old books, quiet mornings, and long walks beneath autumn trees. She smiled every time Grace asked another question about the father she had never met. Instead of answering with sadness, Emily always answered with gratitude. She wrote that Ethan had taught her long ago that character was measured by small acts repeated every day, not by grand speeches or extraordinary achievements. That became the lesson she passed to Grace. She taught her daughter that somewhere there was a man who always returned borrowed tools cleaner than he had received them, who stopped to help strangers change flat tires, who never forgot birthdays, and who believed kindness was something people practiced when nobody was watching. Grace smiled faintly through gathering tears. "Those were never just stories," she whispered. "They were the standard my mother hoped I would use when I finally found you." Ethan looked at her with quiet disbelief. "You found me 3 years ago, did you not?" Grace slowly nodded. "I did." The answer settled over the cemetery with surprising calm. There was no accusation in Ethan's expression, only honest curiosity. "Why did you wait?" Grace looked toward the distant chapel before answering. "Because I was afraid of becoming another loss instead of a blessing." She folded her hands together as though gathering the courage she had carried for years. "I rented a small apartment in Cedar Ridge after college. I found work at the elementary school nearby. Every week, I drove past Miller's garage. I watched you help neighbors who could not afford repairs. I saw you deliver groceries to an elderly widow during a snowstorm. I watched you quietly fix bicycles for children without asking for payment. Every time I thought about introducing myself, I heard my mother's voice telling me that the man she loved would always reveal himself through kindness before words." Ethan lowered his eyes. He remembered the young teacher who occasionally brought the school van to the garage for routine maintenance. She always smiled politely, asked thoughtful questions, and never stayed long enough for conversation. He had never imagined she was studying the ordinary rhythm of his life. Grace reached into her satchel once more and removed a small envelope that had softened with age. Across the front, written in Emily's familiar handwriting, appeared only 2 words. "For Ethan. She asked me to give you this only after I became certain that your heart was still the same one she remembered," Grace said softly. Ethan accepted the envelope with trembling hands, noticing that his own wedding ring rested beside it inside his jacket pocket. One had traveled with him for 20 years. The other had traveled across 20 years to find him. As he carefully opened the envelope, a single folded letter slipped into his hands, and before he unfolded the first page, he recognized the faint scent of lavender that Emily had always tucked between the letters she wrote to the man she never stopped loving. The letter unfolded with the familiar softness of paper that had been opened and folded many times before, as though Emily herself had returned to these words whenever hope became difficult to hold. Ethan recognized her handwriting immediately, and for a brief moment the cemetery disappeared. There was only her voice living quietly between each carefully written line. My dearest Ethan, if Grace has placed this letter in your hands, then she has already discovered what I prayed she would find. Not a perfect man, but a good one. I have never needed perfection from you. I only needed your heart, and that has always been enough. Ethan closed his eyes as a quiet tear slipped onto the page. He gently brushed it away before it could blur the ink. Grace stood beside him without speaking. She knew the letter by memory, yet she had never read it herself. Emily had asked her to honor one final promise. These words belonged only to Ethan. He continued reading. Emily wrote about countless evenings spent telling Grace stories instead of fairy tales. She described the little farmhouse in Cedar Ridge, the white porch swing that creaked softly during summer evenings, the smell of fresh coffee before sunrise, and the old oak tree where two young dreamers had carved their initials while believing the future would always be kind. She wanted Grace to know that a home was never measured by its walls. It was measured by the people who filled it with patience, laughter, and forgiveness. Ethan smiled faintly through his tears. Every detail was exactly as he remembered. Even after years of separation, Emily had preserved those ordinary moments as though they were priceless treasures. Near the bottom of the page, the tone quietly changed. There may come a day when Grace chooses to find you before I can. If that day arrives, please do not ask why she waited. I asked her to be certain first. I wanted her to know the man you had become, not only the man I remembered. Time changes many people. I prayed it would only deepen the kindness already living inside you. Grace lowered her eyes. I tried to obey her exactly, she whispered. Every Christmas I wondered if I should knock on your door. Every birthday, I almost did. But I kept hearing her tell me to wait until the right moment. Ethan folded the letter carefully and slipped it inside the journal before looking at Grace with a warmth that had slowly replaced the confusion in his eyes. For the first time, he truly saw more than a stranger standing beside a grave. He saw the quiet courage it must have taken to carry someone else's final promise for years without knowing how it would end. Hannah stepped forward with a gentle smile. There is one more thing Emily hoped would happen if this day ever came. Ethan looked toward her. Hannah nodded toward the parking area beyond the cemetery gates where his old pickup truck waited beneath the golden maple trees. She hoped the two of you would go home together. Ethan glanced at Grace, who looked both hopeful and uncertain, as though she feared asking for something she had dreamed about her entire life. After a long, peaceful silence, Ethan picked up the bouquet of white lilies from the grass and placed them carefully against Emily's headstone. Then he looked at Grace and offered the smallest, most genuine smile she had ever seen. Come with me, he said softly. I think it is time you finally saw the place your mother never stopped calling home. The drive from the cemetery to Cedar Ridge felt strangely familiar to Grace, even though she had never traveled that road beside her father before. Golden fields stretched beneath the autumn sky while Ethan guided the old pickup truck along the quiet county highway with both hands resting steadily on the worn steering wheel. Neither of them felt the need to fill every silence. Some moments carried too much meaning to be interrupted by conversation. Hannah followed in her own car several minutes behind, quietly respecting the space that only a father and daughter could share after 20 years of absence. As they reached the gravel driveway leading to the farmhouse, Grace drew a slow breath. Every detail matched the stories Emily had repeated throughout her childhood. The white porch wrapped around the front of the house exactly as she had imagined. The weathered porch swing still hung beneath the roof. Wind chimes moved gently in the afternoon breeze, producing the same soft melody her mother once described as the sound that welcomed Ethan home after every long day at the garage. Ethan stepped out first, walked around the truck, and opened Grace's door without saying a word. She looked at the house for a long moment before smiling through quiet tears. She remembered every single detail, she whispered. Ethan nodded. She always noticed the little things. Together they walked across the yard until Grace stopped beneath the enormous oak tree standing beside the porch. She reached out carefully and rested her fingertips against its rough bark. Without searching, she found the weathered heart carved decades earlier. Inside the fading outline remained two initials that time had softened but never erased. Emily had described them so often that Grace recognized them instantly. Ethan laughed quietly, surprised by his own forgotten memory. I carved those the summer I asked her to marry me. Grace smiled. She said you worried they looked crooked. Ethan looked at the carving and gently shook his head. She remembered that too. They stepped inside the farmhouse together. Warm afternoon light filtered through lace curtains, filling every room with a peaceful glow. The grandfather clock in the hallway continued marking each passing second just as it had throughout Ethan's years of waiting. Family photographs lined the walls, each one carefully dusted, each one preserving moments Ethan had never found the courage to put away. Grace slowly walked through the living room, recognizing objects she had only known through Emily's stories. The old quilt folded over the sofa, the stone fireplace, the bookshelf where Emily once kept her favorite novels. It no longer felt like entering a stranger's house. It felt like arriving somewhere her heart had visited for years before her footsteps finally did. Ethan noticed an empty picture frame resting above the fireplace mantel. He quietly removed the faded wedding photograph from the journal and placed it inside the frame. Grace stood beside him as they looked at the smiling faces of two young people who had believed life would always move forward together. For the first time since the accident, the farmhouse no longer felt frozen in the past. It felt ready to welcome the future. Just then Grace carefully lifted the small wooden keepsake box from her satchel and placed it on the coffee table. She looked at Ethan with gentle anticipation before speaking. My mother asked me to wait until we were standing inside this house before I opened it. She said the last gift should always come home before it is finally shared. Grace carefully lifted the lid of the small wooden keepsake box, while the quiet farmhouse seemed to hold its breath along with everyone inside it. The afternoon sunlight drifted through the living room windows, illuminating tiny particles of dust that floated gently through the warm air, as though time itself had slowed to witness the moment. Inside the box rested a neatly folded linen cloth, a small bundle of photographs tied with pale blue ribbon, and an old digital camcorder preserved with remarkable care. Ethan stared at it without moving. His heartbeat quickened as Grace gently removed the camera and placed it into his hands. She recorded this during the final months of her life, Grace whispered. She wanted you to hear her voice one last time. Ethan swallowed hard before carefully pressing the power button. For a brief moment the screen remained dark. Then a soft glow appeared, followed by the familiar image of Emily sitting beneath the great oak tree beside the farmhouse. She looked older than the woman Ethan remembered, yet her gentle smile had never changed. The afternoon breeze lifted a few strands of her auburn hair while sunlight filtered through the branches above her. She looked directly into the camera as though she could somehow see beyond the years separating them. Hello, my love, she began softly. Ethan closed his eyes as tears quietly escaped despite every effort to remain composed. Grace gently rested one hand over his. Emily continued speaking with remarkable peace. If you are watching this, then life carried us farther apart than either of us ever imagined. I wish I could tell you that I found the strength to come home myself. But sometimes our plans belong to time more than they belong to us. She smiled gently before continuing. Please do not waste another day asking why this happened. There are questions that love cannot answer, and there are answers that only forgiveness can accept. Ethan listened without blinking, afraid that even the smallest distraction might steal another precious second. Emily looked toward someone standing behind the camera and smiled warmly. Grace, if you are here beside your father, thank you for keeping your promise. You have carried hope farther than I ever could. Grace quietly wiped away a tear, but never looked away from the screen. Emily turned her attention back toward Ethan. Do you remember the morning we planted the little maple tree near the porch? You told me that real love grows slowly because strong roots cannot be rushed. I carried those words through every difficult day. They reminded me that even when people are separated, love continues growing where eyes cannot see. The recording paused briefly before one final message appeared. Emily stood beside the carved heart in the old oak tree, gently touching the weathered initials with her fingertips. When you stand here again, do not think about everything we lost. Look beside you instead. The greatest part of our story was never left behind. It has been walking toward you one quiet step at a time. The screen slowly faded to black, leaving only silence inside the farmhouse. No one spoke for several long moments. Outside, the wind chimes began their familiar melody while golden leaves drifted across the front porch. Ethan finally looked at Grace, and this time there was no uncertainty remaining in his eyes. There was only gratitude, quiet love, and the peaceful realization that although 20 years could never be returned, the family he believed he had lost forever was finally home.